Picture this. March of 1847, and William Morrison is running for his life across the frozen Yellowstone River. Behind him, 7 Blackfoot warriors are closing the distance, and they're angry. Really angry. Morrison had stumbled into their winter hunting grounds, and now every step he takes on that ice sounds like a gunshot echoing across the frozen landscape. Crack, crack, crack. His elk-hide boots, the same ones every trapper wore, are announcing his position with each footfall. The Blackfoot warriors can track him by sound alone, and Morrison knows it. He's got maybe 200 yards before they're on him, and the nearest tree line is half a mile away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, here's what makes this moment so perfectly historical. Morrison isn't panicking because he doesn't know what to do. He's panicking because he knows exactly what he should be doing, and he can't do it. See, Morrison had spent the previous 5 years living with Shoshone bands in what's now Wyoming and Montana, not trading with them, not visiting them, living with them, learning from them. And one of the things the Shoshone had mastered over thousands of years was how to move across winter ice without making a sound. They had techniques, specialized footwear, an entire body of knowledge about winter travel that most white trappers dismissed as primitive superstition. But Morrison had paid attention. He'd watched. He'd learned. And now, running for his life with standard trapper boots on his feet, he understood with crystal clarity just how deadly that knowledge gap could be. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about what winter meant in the fur trade economy of the mid-1800s. We're talking about an industry worth $12 million annually. $12 million. That's roughly $350 million in today's money. And every winter, this massive economic engine lost 60% of its productivity. Because once the snow fell and the rivers froze, trappers had 2 choices: hunker down in winter camps and wait for spring, or risk death trying to work. The Hudson's Bay Company kept meticulous records, because that's what the British do, and between 1840 and 1847, they documented 300 deaths from ice-related accidents. 300. That's one trapper dying roughly every 8 days, just from falling through ice, hypothermia from breaking through, or injuries sustained trying to move across frozen terrain. And those are just the deaths they knew about. The American Fur Company, the Russian-American Company, the independent trappers. Nobody was keeping those tallies. Think about that for a second. Winter wasn't just the off-season. Winter was the enemy. It was a force that killed skilled men and destroyed fortunes with equal indifference. Now, William Morrison was uniquely positioned to see this problem from multiple angles. His father, Duncan Morrison, had been a Scottish engineer who came to North America in 1814 to work on canal projects. His mother, Marie Laveau, was Métis, born of French-Canadian and Cree heritage, fluent in the rhythms of wilderness survival that Duncan's engineering mind couldn't quite grasp. When both parents died of typhoid fever in 1832, 14-year-old William found himself orphaned, but raised between worlds. He understood European commerce and mechanical thinking from his father. He understood indigenous spirituality and survival techniques from his mother's people. By 1847, Morrison spoke 6 languages: English, French, Scots, Gaelic, Shoshone, Crow, and enough Blackfoot to know the warriors behind him were arguing about whether to take him alive. He could read financial ledgers and animal tracks with equal facility. He could quote Shakespeare and explain the sacred significance of the medicine wheel. He was, in short, a bridge between cultures at a time when most men saw only chasms. And that bridge was about to get burned. See, the fur trade wasn't just about beavers and rivers. It was about ego, reputation, and bitter rivalries that could simmer for years before boiling over. Morrison's primary rival was a French-Canadian trapper named Jacques Dubois, known up and down the Rockies as Black Jack. Dubois was everything Morrison wasn't: loud, violent, suspicious of indigenous peoples, and absolutely convinced that European methods were superior to any native technique. He'd been losing contracts to Morrison for 3 years running, watching this mixed-blood upstart secure the best trading relationships, the richest territories, the most profitable routes. In November of 1847, as trappers prepared for the winter season, Dubois made his move. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation. He simply bribed a supply clerk in Fort Benton, and when Morrison's winter equipment order arrived, certain items were missing. His snowshoes? Gone. The specialized winter moccasins he'd commissioned from Shoshone craftswomen, replaced with standard-issue elk-hide boots, the treated canvas for his winter tent, swapped for cheaper material that wouldn't hold up in sustained cold. Morrison didn't discover the sabotage until he was 3 days into the backcountry, miles from any trading post, with winter already settling hard over the mountains. By then, Dubois was back at Fort Benton, drinking whiskey and telling anyone who'd listen that Morrison's luck had finally run out. That this would be the winter that proved European methods were best. That indigenous techniques were fine for indigenous people, but a real trapper needed real equipment. What Dubois didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he'd just forced William Morrison into a corner that would change the entire relationship between humans and winter ice. Because Morrison wasn't the type of man to give up and trudge back to civilization. He was the type of man who, when backed into a corner, started thinking. And thinking, as we're about to see, was the most dangerous thing William Morrison could do. The winter of White Death. That's what the Shoshone called the season of 1847 to 1848, and they weren't being poetic. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snowfall measured in feet, not inches. Game disappeared into the deep wilderness or died in place, frozen solid where they stood, and William Morrison, sabotaged and stranded, found himself trapped in an ice cave on the eastern slope of what we now call the Absaroka Range. Now, when I say ice cave, don't picture some vast crystalline cathedral. This was a narrow crack in a rock face, maybe 12 feet deep and 6 feet wide, where seeping water had frozen into thick layers of blue ice. Morrison had stumbled into it during a blizzard, and by the time the storm passed, the entrance was sealed with 3 feet of packed snow. He had enough dried meat for maybe 2 weeks if he was careful. He had his rifle, his knife, and a collection of what most trappers would have called junk. Elk bladders he'd been planning to use for water storage, willow bark for cordage, sinew from deer he'd taken weeks earlier, and several beaver pelts he'd already trapped. He also had 23 days before the snow would melt enough for him to dig himself out. 23 days to either freeze to death or figure something out. Here's where Morrison's unusual background becomes crucial. A purely European trapper would have hunkered down, rationed his food, and hoped for rescue. A purely indigenous survivor might have attempted to leave immediately, relying on traditional snowshoes and winter travel techniques. But Morrison had both mindsets colliding in his head and something else. 5 years of watching, learning, cataloguing differences between how various cultures approached the same problem. The Shoshone distributed weight across a large surface area using rawhide webbing. That was the principle. But Morrison had also spent time with a Chinese immigrant named Li Wei, who'd been working on railroad surveys in California before heading north. Li Wei had shown Morrison how Chinese craftsmen used layers of lacquer to waterproof wood, building up thin coats that created flexibility while adding strength. And Morrison remembered Pierre Lamont, a French-Canadian master craftsman in Fort Benton, who treated leather with a mixture of beeswax and pine resin that made it resistant to water and cold without losing pliability. Lying in that ice cave, Morrison started connecting pieces. What if you could combine these techniques? What if you took the Shoshone principle of weight distribution, applied it to a solid platform instead of webbing, treated that platform with the layering technique Li Wei had demonstrated, and then wrapped the whole thing in leather treated with Lamont's mixture? The first attempt was a disaster. Morrison carved thin wooden slats from a broken snowshoe frame, bound them with sinew, and immediately watched them snap when he put weight on them. The wood was too rigid, the sinew too tight. The second attempt cracked the ice beneath him when he tested it in the cave. Too much weight in one place. The third attempt taught him something crucial about sound. When he moved, the wooden slats clicked against each other, and in the acoustics of that ice cave, the sound was deafening. He could hear it echoing off the walls, and he realized this was exactly the problem he'd faced running from the Blackfoot. Sound. Every movement announced itself. While Morrison experimented, 17 trappers died on the same mountain range. Think about that. 17 men, each one experienced, each one equipped with standard gear, each one betting their lives that they could outlast winter using traditional methods. Some fell through thin ice, some got caught in avalanches triggered by their own snowshoes, some simply froze when their equipment failed in the sustained cold. Morrison would later learn their names, but in that cave, he didn't know he was in a race against death that others were losing. The breakthrough came on day 14. Morrison realized he needed to think about the footwear not as a single piece of equipment, but as a system of layers, each one solving a different problem. The base layer would be overlapping wooden slats, thin and flexible, arranged so they could bend with the ice instead of fighting it. The middle layer would be treated sinew, woven in a specific pattern that his crow wife, Morning Star, had once shown him, a technique her family used to bind ceremonial objects so they could flex without breaking. The outer layer would be multiple thin sheets of specially treated hide, each one muffling the sound of the layer beneath it. Morning Star. I need to pause here and tell you about her, because history has a way of erasing the women who made crucial contributions. Morning Star wasn't just Morrison's wife. She was a craftsperson in her own right, from a Crow family of renowned leather workers. When Morrison had described his problem to her months earlier, just in casual conversation, she'd immediately understood what he needed. She'd taught him binding techniques that had been passed through 7 generations of her family, techniques for creating joints that moved without weakening, for distributing stress across multiple connection points. But there was one more piece Morrison needed, and it came from an unexpected source. Marcus Washington was a freed slave who'd made his way to Montana working as a cotton processor in Mississippi before buying his freedom. He'd taught Morrison something about waterproofing that cotton processors had known for decades. Certain natural oils, when combined with plant fibers and allowed to cure under pressure, created a barrier that water couldn't penetrate. Morrison didn't have cotton, but he had beaver fur, and beaver fur had natural oils that were even better. So picture the final design: flexible wooden slats allowing the foot to articulate and distribute weight, bound with crow techniques that let everything move as one unit, layered with Chinese-inspired treatments that waterproofed without adding rigidity, wrapped in French-Canadian leather that stayed pliable in extreme cold, and finally covered with beaver fur treated using Marcus Washington's waterproofing methods. The result was a footwear system that spread weight, gripped ice, shed water, and most importantly, made almost no sound. When Morrison finally dug himself out on day 23, he immediately headed for Mirror Lake, a stretch of black ice about a mile long that had already claimed 6 lives that winter. Black ice is treacherous because you can't see its flaws. It looks solid, looks safe, and then suddenly you're in 40-degree water with your heavy winter gear dragging you down. Dubois and a dozen other trappers were camped on the shore, waiting for the ice to thicken enough for safe crossing. They watched Morrison approach, and they laughed. Laughed, because Morrison looked ridiculous. He was wearing what appeared to be wooden platforms wrapped in fur, like some kind of snowshoe designed by a madman. Morrison didn't say a word. He walked onto the ice, moving with a gliding step that his time with the Shoshone had taught him, and crossed the entire lake. No sound, no cracking, no falling through, just smooth, silent progress across ice that everyone knew was too thin. Then Dubois, his pride wounded and his ego demanding action, strapped on his traditional boots and followed. He made it 30 feet before the ice gave way beneath him. 2 other trappers tried. Both fell through at different points. Morrison had crossed where they couldn't, and suddenly every trapper within 100 miles needed to know how. But Morrison wasn't ready to share. Not yet. He spent the rest of that season field testing, refining, perfecting. And by the time the 1849 rendezvous rolled around, that massive annual gathering of trappers, traders, and company representatives from across the West, William Morrison was ready for his demonstration. He built a platform of black ice, deliberately thin, and invited everyone to watch. Then he strapped on his invention, picked up 300 pounds of beaver pelts, and walked across that ice without a sound, without a crack, without even a tremor. The silence from the crowd was louder than any applause could have been. Representatives from the American Fur Company and Hudson's Bay Company immediately started a bidding war, right there, shouting numbers that made Morrison's head spin. But Morrison understood something they didn't. He wasn't selling footwear. He was selling winter itself, and winter was about to become very, very profitable. Here's the thing about revolutionary technology. The inventor's first impulse is usually to share it with everyone. Morrison's first impulse was the opposite. He went home from that 1849 rendezvous, turned down every offer on the table, and made a list of exactly 5 names. 5 trappers he trusted, absolutely. Men who'd saved his life or whose lives he'd saved. Men who understood that secrets were currency in the mountains. And then he told them everything. This wasn't generosity. This was strategy. Morrison understood that if he tried to monopolize the technology completely, he'd be undercut by imitators within months. But if he created a small, elite group, if he made his invention not just effective but exclusive, he could drive prices up through artificial scarcity. And that's exactly what happened. During the winter season of 1849–50, Morrison and his 5 partners absolutely dominated winter trapping. They worked territories that had been considered worthless after November. They moved through conditions that would have killed anyone else, and they brought back furs while their competitors sat in winter camps burning through supplies and waiting for spring. Fur prices went up 40% that year. 40%. Because suddenly there was a supply shortage in the middle of winter, right when demand from Europe was highest. The American Fur Company and Hudson's Bay Company representatives who'd been so eager to buy Morrison's invention at the rendezvous were now paying premium prices just for the pelts his group brought in, knowing they were being played but unable to do anything about it. But the real test of Morrison's invention came in March of 1850, at a place that would become known as the Battle of Frozen Creek. And I need to be clear about something. This wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. This was a demonstration of how technology reshapes the tactical possibilities of conflict. 20 trappers, all equipped with Morrison walkers, that's what they were calling them by then, were moving a valuable cargo of furs across disputed territory. They knew they were being tracked by a Sioux war party, roughly 60 warriors, and they knew a confrontation was inevitable. In traditional circumstances, 20 men against 60 warriors in open territory would be a massacre. The trappers would have no chance. But the trappers did something the Sioux weren't expecting. They waited until the warriors were positioned along the shoreline of a frozen creek, then moved out onto the ice. The Sioux warriors couldn't follow without snowshoes, and snowshoes on ice are about as effective as roller skates in mud. The trappers crossed safely, turned around, and from the secure position on the far bank, negotiated a peaceful passage. No shots fired, no lives lost, just pure tactical advantage created by being able to move where others couldn't. Word of that confrontation spread fast. Suddenly, Morrison walkers weren't just economic tools, they were military assets, and that made them infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. The industrial espionage started almost immediately. The Hudson's Bay Company sent a woman named Catherine Ashford, a beautiful widow whose husband had supposedly died in a trapping accident. She was charming, educated, sympathetic to the hardships of frontier life, and absolutely determined to get close to Morrison's inner circle. She succeeded with Thomas Brennan, one of Morrison's 5 original partners, a man who'd been alone in the wilderness too long and was susceptible to the kind of attention Catherine offered. Brennan didn't mean to betray Morrison. He really didn't. But piece by piece, over weeks of careful conversation, Catherine assembled enough information to create partial plans. Those plans made their way to manufacturers in St. Louis, Montreal, and Chicago, and suddenly the market was flooded with inferior copies. Footwear that looked like Morrison walkers but didn't have the crucial details right. Wrong wood thickness, wrong binding patterns, wrong layering, and people died. 12 documented deaths in the first 3 months because counterfeit Morrison walkers failed at critical moments. Trappers fell through ice they thought would hold them. Rescue attempts failed because the equipment broke. Morrison watched his invention, which had saved lives, become a vehicle for killing people through shoddy imitation. That's when he established quality certification and patent protections, working with lawyers in St. Louis to create a system of verification. Real Morrison walkers got stamped with a specific mark, a combination of symbols that represented the 4 cultures that contributed to their creation: Scottish, Métis, Shoshone, and Crow. But the human impact of his invention went beyond economics and military tactics. Let me tell you 3 stories that Morrison carried with him for the rest of his life. 8-year-old Emma Paulson fell through river ice in Minnesota in January of 1851. Her father, Henry Paulson, was wearing Morrison walkers because he was a trapper who'd invested in the real thing. He was able to move out onto unstable ice, distribute his weight properly, and pull his daughter from the water before hypothermia killed her. Emma lived to be 83 years old and never forgot the day her father walked on water to save her life. That same winter, a wagon train of 43 Mormon settlers reached the frozen Platte River in what's now Nebraska. It was late in the season, they were running out of supplies, and crossing was essential. But the ice was unstable, temperature was fluctuating, and attempting a crossing with wagons was suicide. Morrison-equipped scouts went first, testing the ice, marking safe routes, and then guiding every wagon across one at a time. 43 people lived because someone could determine where the ice would hold. And then there's Dubois, Black Jack Dubois, Morrison's old rival, the man who'd sabotaged his equipment and set this entire chain of events in motion. In December of 1852, Dubois fell through ice on the Missouri River. He was dying, hypothermic, unable to pull himself out. Morrison happened to be within earshot of the calls for help. He could have walked away. Everyone would have understood. Instead, he strapped on his walkers, moved out onto that treacherous ice, and pulled Dubois to safety. Dubois never trapped against Morrison again. He became Morrison's loudest advocate, telling anyone who'd listen that the man he'd tried to destroy had saved his life without hesitation. Sometimes the best marketing is just being decent when you don't have to be. By 1855, the economic revolution was complete. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad magnate who understood transportation technology better than anyone in America, invested $50,000 to mass-produce Morrison walkers. That's over $1 million in today's money. Vanderbilt wasn't interested in the fur trade. He was interested in railroad construction, in pushing lines through territories that were inaccessible half the year. Morrison's invention made year-round construction possible, and then Queen Victoria's Arctic expedition placed an order for 500 pairs. 500. The British Royal Navy was preparing to map the Arctic, and they needed equipment that would let their men survive conditions that had killed explorers for centuries. Morrison, the orphaned son of a Scottish engineer and a Métis woman, was now outfitting the Queen's own expeditions. Morrison had become an international figure. His invention was enabling Alaska Territory surveys, Canadian Pacific Railway, winter construction, military campaigns, rescue operations, and territorial expansion across North America. He'd transformed winter from an enemy into an opportunity. But success, as Morrison was about to learn, creates its own complicated legacy. And the question of what to do with knowledge that powerful was about to become very personal. By 1857, William Morrison was wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a 14-year-old orphan. He owned property in St. Louis, had investments in 3 railroad companies, and received royalties from Morrison Walker production across 2 continents. He could have retired, built a mansion, lived out his days in comfort. Instead, he did something that tells you everything about who he really was. He built a school, not a school in the traditional sense. Morrison's Integrated Winter Survival Academy was part workshop, part university, part cultural exchange. He brought together indigenous instructors, European craftsmen, and military engineers under one roof in what's now western Montana. Shoshone elders taught weight distribution and winter travel. French-Canadian leather workers demonstrated advanced treatment techniques. Chinese immigrants shared waterproofing methods. Crow craftspeople showed binding techniques that had been perfected over generations. And freed slaves like Marcus Washington taught processing methods that had applications nobody had previously considered. This was radical for 1857. You have to understand, this was pre-Civil War America. Segregation was the law in much of the country. Indigenous peoples were being pushed onto reservations. Chinese immigrants faced brutal discrimination. And here was Morrison, insisting that knowledge transcended race, that survival techniques developed by one culture could be enhanced by insights from another, that the best solutions came from synthesis rather than dominance. The Academy trained a generation of winter specialists who would go on to become polar explorers, mountain rescue pioneers, territorial surveyors, and military cold weather experts. Morrison wasn't just teaching people how to walk on ice, he was teaching them how to see knowledge differently, how to respect expertise regardless of its source. And that knowledge started shaping history in ways Morrison never anticipated. General William Tecumseh Sherman credited Morrison-trained scouts with shortening the Civil War by 6 months. 6 months. Sherman's winter campaigns through Tennessee and Georgia were only possible because his advance units could move through conditions that would have stopped traditional armies cold. They could cross frozen rivers, scout terrain in heavy snow, and maintain supply lines when Confederate forces assumed weather would provide natural protection. Sherman wrote in his memoirs that Morrison's invention had militarized winter itself. Think about what that means. How many lives were saved because the war ended 6 months earlier? How much destruction was prevented? Morrison's footwear, designed to help a trapper survive in the wilderness, had become a tool that reshaped the largest conflict on American soil. The 1867 Alaska Purchase negotiations depended on year-round territory assessment that was only possible with Morrison's technology. Secretary of State William Seward needed to justify spending $7 million on what critics called Seward's folly. Survey teams equipped with Morrison walkers provided winter assessments that proved Alaska's value for fisheries, minerals, and strategic position. Without those winter surveys, without the ability to evaluate territory year-round, the Alaska Purchase might never have happened. Russian America might still be Russian America, and the settlement of northern territories from Minnesota to Alberta was only feasible because supply routes could operate year-round. Towns that would have been abandoned every winter could maintain populations. Trade that would have halted for 6 months could continue. The map of North America was literally being redrawn because winter was no longer impassable. But in 1866, Morrison faced his greatest challenge. Counterfeiters had become sophisticated. They weren't just making cheap imitations anymore. They were creating forgeries so good that even experienced trappers couldn't tell the difference until the equipment failed. And fail, it did. 12 people died that year from counterfeit Morrison walkers that couldn't handle the stress of real winter conditions. 12 people who thought they were wearing legitimate equipment, who trusted their lives to it, and who died because someone prioritized profit over safety. Morrison could have fought this with lawyers, with patents, with prosecutions. Instead, he did something that shocked the business community and made him a legend in the mountains. He released his formula, publicly, completely, every technique, every measurement, every material specification. He published it in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. He sent copies to every trading post, every territorial office, every military installation. He chose lives over profit. The business partners were furious. Vanderbilt called it financial suicide. But Morrison had done the calculation differently. If everyone knew how to make legitimate Morrison walkers, if the techniques were public knowledge, then counterfeiters had no advantage. The market would flood with real equipment at competitive prices, and the fakes would disappear. It worked. Within 6 months, counterfeit deaths dropped to 0. Morrison's royalties dropped to almost nothing, but people stopped dying. In March of 1867, at age 58, Morrison decided to test his invention one final time. He wanted to see how high a man could climb in North America using winter techniques. He headed into what's now Glacier National Park with enough supplies for 2 weeks, heading for an unnamed peak that indigenous guides said no human had ever summited. They found him 3 weeks later, frozen but standing at 14,000 feet, higher than any recorded climb in North America at that time. His Morrison walkers were still strapped to his feet, his face was turned toward the sunrise, and his journal, protected in a waterproof case, contained one final entry. The ice holds no fear for those who listen to its song. That's how William Morrison died. Not in bed, not in comfort, but standing on a mountain peak that shouldn't have been climbable, wearing the footwear he'd invented in an ice cave 20 years earlier, proving one last time that winter could be mastered. The Morrison Foundation was established by his daughter, Sarah Morrison Bighorn, born to Morrison and Morning Star, raised between Crow and Scottish traditions, just as her father had been raised between Métis and European worlds. The foundation still operates today, teaching winter survival to indigenous and non-native youth throughout Montana and Wyoming. They teach the technical skills, yes, but they also teach Morrison's philosophy, that the best solutions come from listening to multiple traditions, that survival knowledge is cultural wealth, and that winter is not the enemy, but a teacher. Morrison's invention evolved into modern crampons, military Arctic gear, and winter rescue equipment used by climbers and soldiers and rescue workers around the world. Every time someone summits Everest, every time a military unit operates in cold weather, every time a rescue team saves someone from an avalanche, they're using principles that Morrison synthesized in that ice cave in 1848. But the real legacy isn't the equipment. It's the idea that drove Morrison from the beginning, that when you're desperate enough, when your back is against the wall, when traditional methods aren't working, the solution might come from combining knowledge that others think shouldn't go together. Scottish engineering and Shoshone wisdom, Chinese techniques and French-Canadian craftsmanship, Crow traditions and cotton processing methods. William Morrison walked on ice without a sound because he understood something fundamental about innovation. It's not about choosing between cultures or traditions or knowledge systems. It's about listening to all of them and finding the synthesis that works. The ice holds no fear for those who listen to its song. Morrison listened, and generations after him have walked safely because one orphaned boy, sabotaged and stranded, refused to see winter as the enemy, and instead learned to hear its music.